just not too long before I had met him, had professed faith in Jesus. Amazing to see somebody come from that background. And he had come to a church that taught a lot of things somewhat similar to us in terms of nonviolence and ideas on divorce, remarriage, etc. And he said, but I have this problem. This problem I have is that they won't take me as a member because as part of the membership process, you have to go through and affirm that the earth was created 6,000 years ago. And he was a pretty highly educated person and from Turkey, and he said, I'm on board with everything that this church teaches, but I can't say that last piece. What am I supposed to do? And wow, that was a hard conversation to have with this guy. I mean, on the one hand, I'm just so excited that here he is, ready to throw his lot in with the church. And you don't want to say bad things about the church, but what do you do in that situation? What would you tell the person? I want to spend some time today talking about how we should be relating to some questions about science and then truth more generally. And it's a very rich and complex subject, and I'm getting personally a lot more engagement on this. I was speaking this past week to a group of Harvard students, and this comes up in a lot of settings about, what's AI going to do? What's AI going to do? And everybody's wondering about how AI is going to change things. And it's so hard to, of course, say, but what we at least can say is that over the last 50 years, I'm 50 years old, it seems like every new step forward with technology, it weakens our ability to wrestle with the truth, to think critically, to hold our attention spans. There's been this kind of slow but steady decline in our ability to do that. And it makes sense, right? Technology, by its very nature, it makes things easy to do. And if things get easier and easier and easier, well, then you get softer and softer. You expect things to be easy. It's harder to fight for the truth. And paradoxically, you kind of expect more things handed to you, and therefore you become more gullible in the process. We know the environment is getting more polarized. There's a lot of concerns out there, and I'll say this: as much as I love groups like these different Harvard student groups, I would say students in general are becoming more zombie-like over time, and there's less kind of going on inside. There's less fire, less questions, less curiosity, and that makes me sad. I want to illustrate some of these trends with something that you've probably heard. You probably heard something like this about Columbus, Christopher Columbus, that he was this courageous person who set sail from Europe at a time when people believed that the earth was flat. And the fear was that if Columbus kept sailing, he would basically fall off of the edge of the earth. And I've heard that a lot, and it's completely false. The whole thing is completely false. I'll tell you, hopefully you know where that myth comes from, but if not, I'll tell you about that. You hear another myth like Galileo was this scientist who was again persecuted by the church, the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church was holding on to this belief that the earth was flat. Another falsehood, another complete myth, not true. I'll read to you from a book by two professors. They're historians of science. Their names are David Lindbergh and Ronald Numbers. They say, quote, "There was scarcely a Christian scholar of the Middle Age who did not acknowledge Earth's sphericity," that it was a ball, "and even know its approximate circumference." Basically, everybody in the Middle Age, with very rare exception, knew that the Earth was round, including everybody at the time of Columbus. The ancient Greeks had discovered that the earth was spherical, and there was a Greek scholar, Eratosthenes, who even calculated the diameter of the earth around 240 BC. So that's near the time the Septuagint was written. So long time ago. And it came from observations, like people would sit and they would watch a ship go off in the distance, and they would notice as the ship would go in the distance the hull of the ship, the bottom of the ship would disappear first, and then you would see the mast, and then eventually the mast, the top of the ship would go away. And so people put that together from ancient times. I mean, the Greeks were a seafaring people. Many people started to notice this, of course, observing the stars. And it was very, very common. Another writer, historian, his name is Jeffrey Russell, he says, with extraordinarily few exceptions, no educated person in the history of Western civilization from the 3rd BC onward believed that the earth was flat. So you might be thinking, well, where did this whole thing about Christopher Columbus and that whole story come from? What's going on here? The actual conversations that Columbus had nothing to do with the earth being flat or falling off the edge of the earth. Again, that's all falsehood. They were debates at the time of, they were calculating based on the various longitudes and meridians how long it would take to make this journey. And people told Columbus, the earth is really big, the ocean is really wide, we don't think you'll have enough supplies to make it. So they all thought the earth was round, but they just said, like, you're going to run out. You're going to run out of energy, manpower, food, all that before you make it over to your destination. That was the conversation. Nobody was telling him he was going to fall off the edge of the earth. He didn't think that. So again, when did these myths, when did these falsehoods take hold? They mostly took hold in the 1800s. And what happened in the 1800s there were a couple of things that happened at the same time. So this will take a little bit to explain, but it's important for us to understand this. So the first thing that happens in the 1800s is this is when the sciences start to become real disciplines. They're not mature yet, but they start to become real. So you start to see biology and chemistry and geology. You start to see, I would say, the beginnings of serious work there, where they become rigorous disciplines. And we'll come back to that in a minute. So you have these disciplines that are growing. And then you have, and this happens right here, just a few miles from us, the rise of this movement called transcendentalism. What's transcendentalism? A lot of us should know what that is. Who are some of the famous advocates of transcendentalism? Yeah, Thoreau and Emerson. That's good. That's the easy part. So what do they teach? What are the core ideas of transcendentalism? So self-reliance is one of the pieces there. I wouldn't say it's the core, but that is one of the pieces. Some of the, I would say the main ideas are that society and the institutions of society have corrupted the individual, and that the way to reclaim this goodness of the individual is to particularly be self-reliant, to connect to nature, to go into isolation, away from all of the hubbub of and the disturbance of these institutions. And there was a lot of appeal to the primacy of intuition, that you don't necessarily need logic and reason, but you could somehow intuit the truth just on your own. And so as transcendentalism, which starts right here in our area, New England, Cambridge especially, it spreads, and you get all these religious movements that grow out of that. So the Swedenborgians, the Mormons. What's the main appeal that Mormons make? What's their, like, if you've ever talked to a Mormon, what do they say? Yeah, the burning in the bosom. Because you'll try to reason with them, and they'll be in a corner, right? And they're like, their doctrines are so outlandish. And they'll say, but I have this burning in the bosom. And whenever you hear that, you should think, oh, that's, well, one, it's kind of a cop-out. But it goes back to when Joseph Smith started Mormonism, which was right in the heyday of this transcendental movement where it was all about appealing to just your gut. I don't need reason. I feel that it's true. It's this very kind of emotional appeal. Christian Science comes out in this time period. Same thing. It's like you hear the tenets of Christian Science. It's neither Christian nor scientific, by the way. When I went to college at a place called Caltech, and my brother didn't know what Christian Science was either. And he says, now that you're going to a science school, maybe you should join a Christian Science church. It's like, no, that's not how it works. So you have this rise of kind of emotionalism, transcendentalism here, at the same time as you have the rise of rigorous science happening all together in the 1800s. And then, of course, Darwinism is the major issue that emerges in the 1800s, and that provokes a huge debate, the famous debate between Thomas Huxley and Samuel Wilberforce at Oxford. And what happens here is there were some very, I would say, crafty writers who say, and make this move, they say, what we're going to do is we're going to use the flat earth as a way to tar Christians as being ignorant, foolish people. And so what people start to do who are more on this Darwinist side of things is they say, you all, on the other side, you must believe in the flat earth. And there was one writer in particular from the 1800s who particularly does something very malicious, I think, which is he locks in on one writer from the early church. So this writer's name is Lactantius. Lactantius lived in the late 200s, early 300s, so late 3rd, early 4th century. And he actually is, to our knowledge, the only early church writer who does advocate a flat earth. And he makes a bizarre argument. If we have time, I can cover it later. Augustine believed in the round earth, for example, but Lactantius believes in a flat earth. And so even though he's in the minority, a writer from the 1800s says, see what the early church teaches, and they cite Lactantius. Those fools believe the earth was flat. And so you should always be suspicious when people make huge generalizations, when the early church says da-da-da-da-da. It's sometimes much more complex. But in this case, they chose one guy who was a very minority view and then claimed that was what Christians believe. Somebody wrote a story about how Columbus was opposed by the church on the grounds that it was this flat earth theory. It didn't happen. It was written way after as a way to, again, kind of mock the Christian position. And somehow that catches on. And I'm guessing a lot of you probably believe that, like Columbus thought this thing that he was being opposed by the church was flat, totally made up in the 1800s by a group of people that were trying to tar Christians. So as this is unfolding, this kind of battle gets more and more pronounced. And today it's often called the conflict thesis. So this is a phrase that you will encounter a fair bit if you haven't already. The phrase is, that's not a good one. This conflict thesis basically says that there's a conflict between Christianity and science, and you have to choose one or the other. And so if you ever hear like Neil deGrasse Tyson, some of you know who that is, he will take jabs at Christianity under the guise of this conflict thesis. Carl Sagan did that. A lot of people today will do that. There's a guy named Jerry Coyne who has a book called Faith versus Fact, Why Science and Religion Are Incompatible. So this has been pushed for so long, for so many years, that many people in the world, many people in the church believe this. And in case you're wondering, Galileo, everybody, including Galileo, believed the earth was round. That had nothing to do with the debate. The debate was around whether or not the earth was at the center or if the sun was at the center. That was the specific conflict point. Nothing about flat earth there. I'll read you a quote from Galileo. He says this: I hold that the sun is located at the center of the revolutions of the heavenly orbs and does not change place, and that the earth rotates on itself and moves around it. But they tried on their own to spread around common people the idea that such propositions are against the Holy Scriptures and consequently damnable and heretical. So basically, there's a bunch of passages that say the earth shall not be moved, the earth is set on its foundations. There's all those kinds of passages. And so people in Galileo's day said, you're teaching heresy. And because you're teaching heresy, he was opposed at that time. Okay, so we have all these myths, all these memes, all these falsehoods about how dumb Christians are and how they've used the flat earth especially as a way to say, like, surely you're not as ignorant as those people. What strikes me even more is that these myths and these falsehoods are still around. Like, it would take any of you 2 minutes to do a search on Google, and you would find, you can do it. Just say, like, did people believe in Columbus's day that the earth was round? Or, it'll take you 2 minutes. And you would be disabused of these ideas. But why do most people continue to believe these things is because there are still forces out there that take advantage of ignorance, and they take advantage of this sort of reactionary nature that humans have, and they exploit polarization. We live in a world today where most people are actually imprisoned by various forms of ignorance, and they don't even want to get out of their cage. It's very, very sad, but true. One of the things that it should be the case that when we come alive, we should say, okay, now it's my time to wrestle and discover and learn and grapple and to chase things all the way down to the ground. This is how humans should be expressing their humanity. It's the glory of God to conceal a matter. How does the rest of that verse go?
The glory of kings to search it out.
Yeah, the glory of kings to search it out. And we're supposed to be royalty. Everybody's supposed to be an expression of the royalty of God. Those two authors that I cited before have said that, okay, this conflict thesis that has been propagated from the 1800s is false. And it's just a terrible lie that's been foisted on humanity. And so they say instead of the conflict thesis, we should adopt the complexity thesis. The complexity thesis says it's a lot more complicated. And this is usually how it is. That, in fact, the history is much more interesting because often, and especially the early scientists, were much more motivated by their Christianity than repelled by it. C.S. Lewis puts it really well to explain why science begins and flourishes as it does. He says, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. And so that basic premise that people thought there would be order in the universe, you didn't see science anywhere near develop in countries that were more pagan in their thinking because they didn't have that same worldview. Kepler, who's the famous planetary scientist, says it well. He says, the chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order which has been imposed on it by God and which he revealed to us in the language of mathematics. Now, I'm grateful that, and I'm so happy that here in Followers of the Way, we don't divide over issues like the age of the earth. If that guy were here, we would say, hey, you don't need to have that be something that hinders you. Come on in. I think we're much more thoughtful. We appreciate learning and loving God with our minds. But I still think it's important for us to press in and even get stronger in what it is to love God with our minds and how to be discerning people. In Proverbs 14:15, it says, the simple believe everything, but the prudent give thought to his steps. I also think this is going to be even more important in the coming age because I do think people will get materially more gullible in the next few years with AI. And so we have to be very careful here. Romans talks about deceiving the hearts of the naive. 1 Corinthians 14, Paul says, do not be children in your thinking. Be infants in evil, but in your thinking be mature. Colossians 2:8, see to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy or empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, which are these divisive spirits, and not according to Christ. All right, I'm going to give some kind of pretty rapid points here on how to do well in this so that we don't fall prey to this. The first thing I'll say, and this is a somewhat unusual application, but I think it's right, but is that I think we should fall in love with science since it's the expression of God's mind. Now, I know a lot of people treat science as like something you just have to do in high school, or you have to do it in college, and you do it and you're done. And to me, that's sad. It's become this kind of like burden or chore. And the reason it's sad is because it is quintessentially the work of God. I'll read you a quote from a guy named Randy Newman who says, "Christians should love science. How could we, who love the maker of the heavens and the earth, not celebrate the systematic, diligent, communal investigation of the world God made?" There's something that's healthy about being a well-rounded, multidimensional person who can find delight in many fields. If somebody is just like, they only do one thing and they can't even appreciate anything else, I think, that's sad. We should be humans when they're fully human, can appreciate beauty and appreciate truth in all different kinds of fields. Everyone should have, to some degree, some appreciation of science and math. If you love art, think of science and math as God's art. You're looking how God designed our world. A lot of people, again, think that science is just something that foreigners do or that nerds do. That's sad. It makes us clear thinkers. It says in Psalm 111, verse 2, "Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them." One of the things that I think we should do is get out of this myth, this falsehood that's been propagated on us, which is that, and Christians I think have believed this as much as anything, that we don't need to have this be a lifelong area of growth. I'll give an example of this. Several years ago, I'd go through museums, and you know how there'll be an exhibit, and it'll say, "This is from the Mesozoic era. This is from the Cretaceous period." And I was honest with myself, and I was like, I don't really know when these are. I know it's like a long time ago, but like I don't really know. And I'd go to this museum, and it would kind of be like in one ear, out the other. And so I said, you know what? That's not okay. Like I'm a human. I should be able to do better. And so I went home and I made electronic flashcards, and I said, I'm going to learn this. I'm going to learn the eons, the eras, the epochs, the periods, the ages. Laid it all out. And then a couple of weeks ago, for our family day, we went to the Harvard Museum of Natural History. And as the children will attest, I was like, guess what? Look what ages this is from. And I connected all the years and everything. It's like, this is amazing. And the whole experience became so much richer because I could say, like, hey, I know this age, I know this period, and I could connect it. And you may not even necessarily agree with the way the museum artists put it all together, but it was a completely different experience. We should be able to walk out, and when you see a tree, can you use trigonometry to figure out how tall the tree is? It's not that hard. It's a high school skill. That's a good thing to be able to do, right? To know that. When you take a medicine, do you just blindly take it and just think like, oh, I'm just eating something? Or do you ask, like, what's it doing? What's it doing to my body? What protein is it binding to? There's a certain level of curiosity that should be activated and healthy and that we should embrace. And I think Christians should be the highest and the best in this. We should be the most curious and asking these questions, even if you're not a person who is, say, a science major or something like that. At the same time, we want to be aware of the limits of science. There is an excess of this, which is sometimes called scientism, where it overstates the power of science, and it says something like science is the only way we can access truth. That's not true either. The most important questions are beyond the scientific method. What's the scientific method? This should be really easy. What is it?
It's evidence-based.
Yeah, it's evidence-based. There's some steps in that. Yeah, you make observations. Yeah, normally you have a hypothesis, and then you make observations. Yeah, you test the hypothesis. Yeah, you can either accept or reject that, and you go on these loops, right, where you figure out whether or not something is true or not. But if I were to say something like, all right, how can science address this? What happens after I die? Who should I marry? Guess what? Scientific method doesn't work so well in those cases, right? You're not going to run that experiment multiple times. The most important questions in life are actually beyond the scientific method, but that doesn't diminish the value of science. I'll read you a quote from Erwin Schrödinger. Some of you know Schrödinger. He won the Nobel Prize for his work in quantum mechanics. And I love that he says this. He says, "I am very astonished that the scientific picture of the real world around me is very deficient. It gives us a lot of factual information, puts all of our experience in a magnificently consistent order, but it is ghastly silent about all and sundry that is blue, bitter, and sweet." Sorry, that doesn't make sense. "About all and sundry that is really near to our heart and that really matters to us. It cannot tell us a word about red and blue, bitter and sweet, physical pain and physical delight. It knows nothing of beautiful and ugly, good or bad, God and eternity." Science sometimes pretends to answer questions in these domains, but the answers are very often so silly that we are not inclined to take them seriously. Next point is, let's be a people who engage in primary sources, or at least trust those who do. I think engagement in primary sources is one of the litmus tests for someone's ability to make truth claims. A lot of us remember what COVID was like and all of the agony there. And I did these webinars on COVID during that time. And man, the amount of opinions that I would hear about this. And you would hear everything under the sun about a vaccine or this or that. And first question I was always asked is what's the evidence? What's the paper? Well, I haven't read any papers on it. Well, how do you know this then? What's the serology? Show me the AE tables. What's going on here? And people just look totally confused because they've probably never read a paper in their life. You have to engage in primary sources, or at least say, I can't, so therefore I can't have strong opinions. When Galileo was being opposed here, he wrote a letter, which I love this little snippet. He writes to Kepler, another great scientist. And he says a little bit harshly, but I'll read it anyway. He says, "My dear Kepler, I wish that we might laugh at the remarkable stupidity of the common herd. What you have to say about the principal philosophers of this academy, who are filled with the stubbornness of an asp, the snake, and do not want to look at either the planets, the moon, or the telescope, even though I have freely and deliberately offered them the opportunity 1,000 times. Truly, just as the asp stops its ears, so do these philosophers shut their eyes to the light of truth." So Galileo had this telescope, and he would say, "All right, you all want to oppose me? Come, let's look at the telescope together. Let's write, and you tell me what to make of this. You give me your explanations. Here's the data. We'll go look together." And again, Galileo was refused. And he said, this is just a willful ignorance. People don't want to experience the primary data for themselves. This past week, some of you are in my biology class. I showed everybody what's the database to look at where the real clinical trials are published. That's something everybody should be able to do in order to assess, should I have this therapy or not? Next point is strive. This is a very short point. Strive to be a careful, inductive reader. When you look at especially the days of Genesis, I talked about this at the beginning when this young guy from Turkey was struggling. And I have labored over Philo and Origen and Augustine. And all three, they say these are not 24-hour days. All three, Philo, Origen, and Augustine. Augustine has a whole book on this. And when you read how all these three writers do that, they do so picking up observations that most people today don't even know about. If you don't know their arguments, you can ask me later. But I so admire the care and the attention that they gave to reading the Bible. Today, it is just the opposite. Next point, to seek nuance over dogmatism or blanket statements. So when you get a piece of mail in your house, and it has in big all-cap letters on the front of the piece of mail, urgent, important, open now, right? What do you tend to do with those? You tend to pitch those into the trash, right? Because the all caps, the red, the giant tells you that they're trying to scam you in some way. Like if you see a tweet that's all caps, it's like, okay, something's wrong with this person. right? You tend to, hopefully you think that. It's kind of like that in just like handling truth, right? If however it's coming to you, if it's coming to you with this like all caps, no nuance, just blasting you, just like the junk mail should go into the garbage, that should probably go into the garbage too. A lot of podcasters out there are all caps podcasters. And I noticed that's becoming, just a very powerful source of opinion. Next point in how we find truth, listening inquisitive debate is better than one-sided presentations. Listening inquisitive debate is better than one-sided presentations. There's not a lot of great examples of debate, but there are some. This is actually very timely this coming week, because this coming week there's a huge conference that's going to be here in Boston. It comes to Boston every 3 to 4 years. It's called ETS. ETS is the Evangelical Theological Society. And it's their flagship meeting. It rotates between a handful of cities, Boston being one. And this year, hopefully you all know this, it's the celebration of the 1700-year anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. So Nicaea was 325 AD. This year is 2025. That's exactly 1700 years. And so this year's ETS is going to be all Nicaea all the time. Lots of messages on the Trinity, etc. It's pretty neat. The Anabaptists are celebrating 500 years, but Nicaea is 1700 years. That's a long time. ETS actually has, I like the way they run a lot of their sessions. I will be there. I might see some of you there. What they do is they actually model pretty well some good patterns for us. So ETS is famous for a lot of its debates. And the way they do it is, and I copied and pasted a section of this, is they'll have a 3-hour block. Okay, so here's a block that you can go to on Tuesday. It's called Noah's Flood Revisited. The first speaker is Hugh Ross. Some of you know him, Reasons to Believe. Then his respondent, who disagrees with him, will be Greg Davidson, who's a geologist. Then Tremper Longman, some of you know him. He's an Old Testament commentator. Will be giving an exegetical perspective. Then they're going to have Matthew McLean, who's a young Earth geologist, speaking forth. And then all of them are going to have a panel together, and then they do Q&A. And they're very civil, and they're actually run well. And I love that format because there's no straw man. Everybody there believes their different views. You can go and sit and listen, and you learn a lot in settings like that. That's a way better way. If people are shouting and all that, okay, there's something wrong. But in these kinds of settings, it's very helpful. Next point, read long-form content instead of algorithm-driven snippets. This is one of the reasons why the polarization is happening, is the algos are just feeding people more and more of the super extreme, titillating, you gotta look at this. But how many books or longer articles have you read or listened to on whatever topics that are of interest? Be careful about these little algorithm-driven snippets. I'm very cautious about that. Next point is favor knowledge and expertise, being wary of Dunning-Kruger. So we talk about Dunning-Kruger a fair bit here in our settings, but I'll repeat in case you don't know. Dunning-Kruger was based on studying, it was kicked off by a guy who did something unbelievably foolish. So I don't know how many of you used to do this. I did this when I was young, but I would take lemon juice, and you can use lemon juice as a way to make invisible ink. Anybody ever do this? So you can do that, and if you write a message with lemon juice on a piece of paper, it'll look almost blank. But if you hold it under the right lamp and the right angle, you can see the message. And so my brother and I would get lemon juice and write little messages on it. So that's kind of a fun little child trick. So what this guy did was he said, I want to rob a bank. And he decides to cover his face with lemon juice, thinking that he would be invisible as he robs the bank. And of course, he wasn't invisible. And they catch him, and everybody's thinking, how in the world could somebody believe something so foolish that if you put lemon juice on your face, nobody's going to see you? And so these two people study this, Dunning and Kruger, and they find out that there's this general pattern that humans have, which is the less you know about something, the more confident you are about it. It doesn't make any sense, but that's how humans are. And it's been shown again and again in all kinds of fields. The less you know about something, the more common you are, the more sure you are. So the less you know about immunology, the more confident you will be about the COVID vaccine. The less you know about astronomy, the more sure you'll be about the flat earth, et cetera, et cetera. And it's so funny because, people today, they love to at least publicly bash the experts and bash people who have knowledge and expertise until they need brain surgery. When they need brain surgery, where'd you go to med school? How many times have you done this? Do you know? Like all of a sudden they want the experts because they know deep down that this doesn't make a lot of sense. But in general, people are very susceptible to this Dunning-Kruger effect. Next point, favor systematic evidence over anecdotes. Anecdotes are very sticky. People love anecdotes because they just like stories. Laura and I were talking to somebody recently who thinks the whole Gaza situation is a hoax, that people aren't starving, there's nothing going on there, all that. And we're just like, how do you believe that? How can anybody believe these kinds of things? And they latch on to like one random anecdote that they heard from somebody on some podcast somewhere. And see, this is true. This happens again and again. Jesus tells us that we should know if somebody is legit or not by their fruits. And that means assessing the totality of their fruits, not just one isolated little spot. There's a whole lot to be said about this and how to do this well. Next point is be careful about Gnostic porn. Be careful about Gnostic porn. A few years ago, there was an individual who some of us know who was very convinced on the flat earth, and he was being pretty evangelistic about the flat earth and said, you got to watch these videos. You got to watch these videos. All right, I'll watch the video. And so I watched this video. I watched several of these videos, and this is when I came up with this phrase, Gnostic porn, because I was like, man, what these videos are trying to do is they're trying to make you feel like you're an insider and you have this like secret knowledge that nobody else has, and you feel kind of like, whoa, man, like if I can't believe this is incredible, and all those sheep out there, they're just being deceived here, and you really do feel the sense of almost like pride or like arrogance that comes from that. When I say Gnostic porn, it's not a physical pornography, but it's the porn that comes from having this like privileged knowledge that you think sets you apart from everybody else. And this is one of the reasons why, again, things can go viral as much as they have. Next, stay close to godly people who have the fruit of the Spirit. So in this age of deception, it's going to be increasingly important to avoid deception by looking at character. We are moving into a time when people are ranting, yelling. It's just like, it's really disturbing. Politicians even are embarrassed. I was watching an interview earlier today where even politicians are saying, this is so out of hand to compare to even 10 years ago. And in this realm where fewer and fewer people have love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, that'll be a good marker for us to gravitate to in an age of conflict and people who are very hot. So we are today, summing up here, and I'm going to be concluding in the next 5 minutes, we are in a very dire situation. Many people believe in this conflict thesis. Many people believe these falsehoods about Galileo and Christopher Columbus and things like that. And then when they believe it, it can even have somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy to it. We should reject this conflict thesis and instead adopt a complexity thesis. Science and truth are actually fostered by a proper understanding of Christianity. America once had a more robust intellectual discourse. I haven't verified this statistic myself, but I read once that 117 of the first 119 colleges in America were founded with Christian motivations to promote Christianity in their documents and the gospel. That's amazing. 117 out of 119. But what happens? The rise of transcendentalism, talked about that, in the 1800s, this emotionalism that spreads, the rise of now these disciplines of science, and particularly Darwinism, that really creates a wedge that's exploited by those who advance this conflict thesis. And there's a brilliant phrase from a Christian writer, his name is J.P. Moreland, who says that what happens in the 1800s this is a great phrase to write down, the privatization and the decognitivization of Christianity. So Christianity becomes privatized. It becomes like a much more individualistic experience in the 1800s, and it becomes decognitivized. It becomes less of a something that rests on evidence and reason, and more something that you just do because your intuition tells you to do it. And so it leads to this split that basically you go to science, you go to those kinds of discipline for knowledge, but you go to religion for faith. But isn't it interesting that the New Testament has a close balance and lifts both knowledge and faith together? The verb form for I know, ginosko, is used 222 times in the New Testament. I believe, I have faith, pistevo, is used 246 times, almost equal there. And they are used so often together in the scriptures. And so often knowledge is highlighted as crucial for the life of the Christian. 2 Peter 3:18 says, "But grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ." Hosea 4:6, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I reject you from being a priest to me." So God rejects the priests over that. Today, the association with Christianity in the popular world is it's going to tell you to be kind, to be nice to people, be loving, be honest, all that. How many people have the association that being a Christian means the greater application of your mind? I don't think a lot do. I think, again, this conflict thesis has done its job really well, where people generally don't think that. Elton Trueblood has said it this way: the Christian faith is the sworn enemy of all intellectual dishonesty and shoddiness. At least it should be. This is a sad state of affairs. People today often have, as an adjective for the word, in front of the word faith, they'll have the word blind in front of it. Blind faith. Blind faith, they mean like, oh, just turn your brain off, right? That's what Christianity, just turn your brain off, just have that blind faith, just jump in. But instead, faith should be the response to evidence, not turning your mind off. When I think about that church that unfortunately told that young man that he couldn't be a member there, that church is living in the grip still of this conflict thesis and doesn't realize that many great Christians, and I don't even care if people want to believe in 24-hour days, that's fine. Sure, believe it. I'm perfectly happy to be in fellowship with people who are, but to insist on those kinds of strictures is ahistoric, and it's a legacy of the conflict thesis from the 1800s. So are we going to step up? Are we going to do our part as we look ahead? And I think what's going to be the next 5 to 10 years are going to be a scary few years, I think, as we figure out, as humanity figures out all this AI stuff, and these corporations know that this is the way they're going to be able to lock their teeth into people and get more and more engagement and funds from them. So we need to be discerning, we need to be wise here in our age. Let's close in prayer. Father, I pray for help as we seek to navigate these perilous times, as there are more and more people who are being deceived, being polarized, being estranged one from another, being isolated, who don't understand that there is no lack of conflict between Christianity and reason, but instead there is a great synergy between them. We have all too often fallen prey to this conflict thesis, and I pray instead that we would be those who are not victims to privatization or decognitivization, but instead a robust application of knowledge and faith into our lives. Help us to be curious, to love your world, to love your creation broadly, to not be zombies, but to be people who are activated in our human heights of what it is to be curious, to explore, to reason, to think, to not be afraid of discourse, of debate, which are in service of the truth, but to embrace it. I pray even this week for all those who will be here, the many speakers who will be here, those going to ETS, that we could sharpen one another, and may we be better Christians as a result. We pray all these things in Jesus' name.